Welcome to Exposure Part 2 lecture from Art142, Introduction to Digital Photography. So let's recap the previous exposure lecture. What is exposure? It is the amount of light that reaches your camera's sensor or film. What is shutter speed? The amount of time the curtain or shutter is open in the camera that allows the light to reach the sensor or film. What is ISO? The light sensitivity of either the film or image sensor. What is aperture? A hole through the lens that allows light into the camera, into the sensor or film to expose it. Like the eye moves when it's light and dark, it is measured in fractions like f-stops. This lecture will be talking about metering and histograms. So if you metered in a film camera, it's how the camera reads the scene presented, and it gives the photographer an average guess if it is a good, over or underexposed. So if you shot film through this method, you may be looking through your viewfinder and you have a needle that either goes up when it's more exposed, overexposed, or down to underexposed, and you have to sort of balance it in the center. And that's how you know it's a good average reading. However, your camera may not understand it, so you would always want to change one parts of your exposure triangle. I would usually change the aperture to kind of get a bracket exposure. So when you're shooting digital, you would have a little like this either in your viewfinder, on the back of your LCD screen, or even on the side if your camera has it. So how does the camera know if something is a good or a bad exposure? So film cameras read 18% gray. It's a middle gray reflected light meter that's light bouncing off subjects. It's always looking for an average brightness. The reason behind this is that it believes that most scenes should average to a mid-gray, as again 18% gray. The middle gray is midpoint between the darkest shadows and the brightest highlight. The camera cannot read white or black or colors, so it's using this method to get some sort of form of exposure based on the tonality of the overall scene. Now there's a few different ways on how the camera reads it. So the first one we're going to talk about is matrix or evaluative. Depending on the type of camera you have, it will be called different things. So it evaluates the zones for the process. So sometimes there may be one focal point that you can adjust, or many focal points, which will be lots of little tiny dots. As you can see, these are focal points. And it will read all the different scenes through the frame, whether it's a center frame or a focus emphasis of the zone, and it kind of gives a base metering off that. This is really great for landscape or cityscapes, and if you are still starting off, it's probably good to start off with it. You can change the default where it will change its emphasis based on a focal point as well, and you can read your manual on how to adjust this. There is center weighted, so it gives preference in a spot in the center, and it's always going to be the center. For the preference, it gives predictable results. So it says that's how we're going to get our reading for 18% gray. So it takes the reading only from the area that it's reading. This is really great for headshots, or when your subject is in the center only, and it's great if the surroundings are different. So if this background is darker, you don't want it to take a reading off of that when you really just want to focus your exposure on the center. Canon often also offers partial metering, which is larger than center weighted, but it works very similar. Next we're going to talk about is spot metering. It gives the most control. It kind of looks at one spot only. So it gives control if you really are trying to focus on something small, whether it be a bird, and you should be able to adjust this by the focal points like this that you can change, and cameras will have different types of focal points. Sometimes you may use a gray card for exposure. So your camera is looking for 18% gray. So if you shoot an 18% gray card, your camera will say this is a proper exposure. So based on the light in the scene, you can hold a gray card up that sort of fills the scene and take your reading off that, especially when you're using spot metering. And then you can take the reading off that to say the camera will say this is a good exposure based on its exposure evaluating meter. And if it says it is, then you can remove your gray card and shoot as normal. It's kind of a way to get an accurate exposure. Next, we're going to talk about histograms, and they help you evaluate exposure in camera through the LCD on the back, and it reads the pixels. So this right here is your histogram. So this looks at all of your images, pixels, on a scale of 0 to 255 in black and white, and stacks them. So 0 would be on the left and 255 on the right, and it gives a numeric number for the pixels. So, and all the black pixels are stacked up, the shadows and highlights from left to right. And this can give you an idea of how many pixels you have. So this will be all of your shadows and all of your highlights. You have a peak and your midtones in the center. So blacks on the left, shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites. And as you can see with this scene, if it's overexposed, all the pixels are on the right, underexposed, all the pixels are on the left. This is also referenced in Camera Raw. You can use the histogram to adjust, and we'll talk about the histogram a bit when we're in our Camera Raw lecture. Now definitely go over both lectures. There's some videos to watch, make notes, and do a little studying to be prepared for your exposure quiz, which will reference both Part 1 and Part 2. And I want to wish you the best of luck.